This is the Person of Interest podcast, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell.
Well, welcome back to the Stockholm School of Economics here in Riga, and today we have a guest who's much more familiar with these rooms, I think, than I am even, Dr. Arnis Sauka, who's a professor here at SSE. Welcome, Arnis.
Hi.
Maybe welcome's not the right word, but welcome to this room at this particular time. Arnis is director of the Centre for Sustainable Business here at SSE Riga, and he's the author of several, or co-author in some cases, of several influential reports each year, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on. And we also hope to cover the whole area of interaction between academia and policy, political world, academic world, and so on, and see how that's developed and interacted in recent years. But first of all, Arnis, could you give us a little introduction to yourself about how you came to be in this line of work and how you came to be in this particular place?
Yeah, well, probably almost by accident, because I had no intention to be in academia when I was a kid. We all have our dreams when we are young or very young, and my dream was to be a captain on a big ship and travel around the world and see the places. Probably because those were Soviet Union times and we could not really travel that much, or we could not really go out of Latvia. And I even took the steps to fulfill my dream. After the primary school, I tried to enter it was not Marine Academy, it was a professional school. When afterwards you can go to Marine Academy, and they gave me 0 for the essay because zero because nobody could read what I have written, because we did not type back then. We were writing, and my writing was so bad that
so you already had academic handwriting.
I had something like doctors or academic, but then I entered the high school, still with intention to go afterwards to this Marine Academy, and we started with the Junior Achievement Program, our school company, the small cafeteria in the school. So I got interested in entrepreneurship, in business. Then I thought I will be either in the business or business management. After that, I really worked for several companies in various positions. And in one of those companies I worked for, I was responsible for government tenders and working with the government tenders. Here I saw lots of corruption, bribery, many things that really triggered my interest. How comes that this is the way it is, that for instance, whenever we signed my company signed a contract with the government for the government tender, then we cannot really reach those people because they are probably on the holiday for the money, for the bribe the company has probably paid for getting the tender. So that triggered my interest, and to the next extent that I entered the Ph.D. studies. And then I realized that I should have international outlook. So it was not really sufficient in terms of the quality that was available here. So I got a scholarship. I found I was looking and I found some opportunities. So I spent 1 year in London, University College London. Then I spent 1 year with another scholarship in Sweden doing a PhD studies. Then I ended up in Germany and finished my PhD there. And then I returned back to Riga and started to do something for SSE Riga. Back then, intention was like maybe 1, 2, 3 years, and that was back in 2008 or even earlier. So here I am.
So it's interesting. So from the way that you've described it, you were involved in business. You saw this sort of evidence of corruption and examples. And it was this that kind of triggered the road into academic study of it, which is kind of the reverse of what often happens, I think.
So I never liked to learn only from books. I think it's boring. I mean, of course, I'm fine if people do this, and I know that many people in academia are doing that. So the way they generate the knowledge is by reading academic articles, and then they put together the literature review. So and then they try to make a contribution, and this is one way of surviving and living in academic world. Even when I was studying on the bachelor's level and master's level, I always combined work the work in the school with work outside of the school, because I thought that if you cannot apply something what you learn in the school, you cannot say that you master this knowledge, and mastering this knowledge to me it has always been very important, right? I mean, I started my first company when I was 14, I guess, and now I'm 42, so I have quite a lot of experience in entrepreneurship, even before entering academia, and that really helps also in academic world, and also now much of what we do comes not from the books, but comes from interaction with the policy makers or entrepreneurs or industry associations, and maybe that's why some of our research is kind of relevant. And when I say our, I mean also my colleagues, because many of us here at SSE Riga are involved in applied and fundamental sort of research.
And when you were attending the various universities in various different countries as well, then were you sort of collating information about shadow economy, corruption, those sort of things, and comparing it to your experience in Latvia, or? Well,
as I said, my interest started from the business world, but I wrote a doctoral dissertation. The Ph.D. thesis was on productive and destructive entrepreneurship, and of course I traveled quite a lot during the writing stage of the Ph.D. thesis, and of course met many people that are involved in this type of research, and we combine methodologies and approaches and so on and so forth. But basically, at the end of the day, the shadow economy index of the Baltic countries that we launched back in 2010 or to 2011, I think, it was developed from the doctoral dissertation. And also meeting the Tal Sputnic, the co-author of the index, who is professor in finance. So we basically combined the business management approach or micro approach and the macro approach from financial economics to come up with something rather unique in academic kind of world. We also have published academic papers in good journals on the topic, and of course also trying to inform the society about what we do and work with the policymakers.
Well, I think I can claim to have been there at the launch of the first index when it was presented here as well. So I followed it with interest over the years, and it's a very interesting example of what you say is what describe as like applied academic knowledge rather than just theoretical, because there's a lot of field research involved in putting it together. But then, interestingly, it's kind of become, it's an annual event, but it's kind of become the official index, or it's kind of supported by policymakers as an indicator that they can rely on. I just wondered if you could sort of talk us through how that has become the case, because I imagine you just did it as a one-off initially, or was it always planned to be a long-term project?
Well, back then we were not really thinking about very long-term intentions, but we created the first index, which is not that index. So it was some sort of the first study which was targeted towards the measuring of something that we did not even know what it is, gray economy or black economy, or the shadow economy term also came a bit later, and then we presented the findings of this study here at SSE Riga, and a few people came, and even a few journalists came. But I had a feeling that the topic is really worth investigating much more in depth, and then it also deserves to be put on the agenda. And then we teamed up with the Chamber of Commerce and Industry and Ministry of Finance, and we created this annual. There is no annual shadow economy conference, and as it sometimes happens. We presented the index. There was lots of discussion about this, and then we decided that we should simply continue doing that. Later on, of course, we also had some, and we still have some supporters. Back then, there were no supporters. So the way it happened was that I entered the office of director of SSC Riga and asking that I need some 20,000 euros to launch the Baltic shadow economy or whatever it's going to be, and he found money for that, which was very kind of, I think, very risky back then, because I was just after the PhD thesis, and then neither me nor Talis has ever done these type of things. So without the support, without these things, that would also not happen. But then I think also the partners helped, and it was on the agenda, and later on. Later on, I also involved in various activities that are related to shadow economy with the Ministry of Finance, with the Ministry of Economics, and so on and so forth. And somehow it led to the situation that is now. But it was not really intention at the very beginning.
You didn't think, well, in 10 years' time we're going to be
No, not at all. I mean, when you do research, you really do what you enjoy doing, and in some cases, some ideas fly, some ideas fly academically, some ideas fly sort of in applied manner. I think this is the one which turned out to be rather successful, both academically and also when it comes to the applied. Certainly, you should put effort in promoting in both to the both sides, but yeah.
Because in some ways it's a bit of a sensitive topic as well, or I imagine it particularly was at the time, coming off we're right in the middle of the crisis. There were lots of bad headlines. Yeah. I imagine there must have been some people who would have rather the research didn't come out unless it was very good or positive. Do you encounter that sometimes, that it's all very well to have some data come out as long as it supports our position, and data which is embarrassing or which maybe shows the problem's bigger than we thought it was, and will result in questions asked to us about what we're doing about it, should be sort of kept in the background a bit more. Is that something you've had to deal with?
Certainly, and not just once. And the good thing is that here at SSC Riga we are really independent as researchers. I'm also not involved in any political sort of parties, even though of course there has been some offers, and there are time after time. But this independence helps us to be really independent and really show what data suggests, right? So. But there has been situations, not these days really anymore, because they know they cannot really influence us. But there has been situations when just to give you one example, we always invite some top policymakers, so ministers, prime ministers, to the conference, and in early years, when we called, let's say, to the Ministry of Finance or any other ministry, so the first question they asked was, so what is the trend? So if the trend was negative, so basically if the shadow economy went up, then it was very likely that ministers will not come,
because that means they're going to get lots of awkward questions.
Yes. Then they still send people, but maybe second, third people. If the trend was good. Then, of course, all the ministers were here at SSC Riga Soros Auditorium saying how much did they do for this to happen, right? And you're not always liked by people or by policymakers or by whomever. If you come up with bad news, I was once the former Minister of Finance once publicly said that Schneider, who is another person. Professor from Austria who does the shadow economy using different method, and according to his estimate, the shadow economy in Latvia is somewhat similar to what we are showing, but in other countries, Lithuania, Estonia, the shadow economy is higher, and Minister of Finance said that Sauka does not like Latvia as much as Schneider does, right? So for me, being Latvian, I have to report what data says, and even if Latvia looks worse in the context, then I still have to report this. It's not about being
your data must be more patriotic.
Yes, but I was accused. I've been accused not just once of not being a Latvian patriot, patriotic enough for Latvia.
Well, don't worry, it happens to the best of us. But I guess there's also, it's become stronger, or there is a certain amount of defense to those sorts of attitudes now. The fact that it's been going for so long, people expect it every year, but also there have been sort of fluctuations traced along the way. Some years it is a little bit of a surprise. It's not just a steady trend all the time, which to me actually suggests that the data is probably quite credible, because if it's sort of counterintuitive, then...
Well, see, nobody can claim, not a single person in the world can claim that their method is the best and really the 100% accurate when it comes to the measuring shadow economy. It's not a phenomenon that can be easily measured, and there is no like 100% accurate methods. But even if the clock is a bit kind of wrong in something, then it still shows time. It shows maybe a bit wrong time, but it shows time consistently wrong. So what I'm saying is that you can for sure rely on the dynamics of the methodology. So even if we can argue whether shadow economy is really 24%, as we showed it in 2019, there is also variance. It is 22 to 26, and the 24 is the best guess you can make within the confidence intervals. But then for sure the dynamics is something that you can trust. And if our estimates show that the shadow economy is increasing or decreasing, then most likely this is really the case. And I think that's one thing. Another thing is what is good for our method is that we don't merely measure the amount of the shadow economy, but we also talk about the causes of the shadow economy, starting from likelihood to being caught and ending with satisfaction with the state revenue service and other institutions, which is I hope also very important for the policymakers, because one thing is knowing how much the shadow economy is, but another thing is to understand why and what is that thing that we can do, or things that we can do, and I think that is another reason why the shadow economy index is relatively well perceived also by the policymakers.
Well, do you think that perception might actually have reached the stage where the fact that the index has been running for a while, people know it, might make people participating actually more open about more? I mean, I imagine at the beginning maybe it was difficult to get people to respond in an open way to. They might have suspected that this information will come out, that they will get a reputation that they're involved in the shadow economy. Whereas now that it's seen as a credible annual academic exercise, maybe they're a bit more willing to be straight with you in the data.
Or vice versa, they could know that we are doing this for that purpose, and they could lie more than they.
True.
So that is a tricky thing. We could talk a lot how we have about the methodology of the index. As I said, it comes from the Ph.D. studies, the doctoral dissertation that I did, and it is not that easy to collect data to convince people that they can talk openly about this. But just a small input maybe. When I was collecting data back in 2005, I guess, for my doctoral dissertation, I also was convinced that nobody will talk about these issues. So I did 133 or something face-to-face interviews with people, and it turned out that entrepreneurs are actually quite open to talk about the shadow economy practices to the extent that you can even talk about these issues over the phone. And if you phrase the question correctly, for instance, we don't ask about themselves; we ask about companies in the industry, and so it's possible to. And we use also other techniques in order to get as truthful responses as possible. We are currently with Stalis we're thinking about putting together a study that goes even further to check and double check reliability, because we did many things initially, like based on intuition and some of course empirical evidence on some conceptual frameworks, but But now in 10 years, the theories has developed, and there are some theories developed that we can use in order to justify or maybe change the way we phrase the questions, the way we interpret the results, and so on and so forth. So it's never-ending process when it comes to development these scales. And
I think one very, very important thing that it did achieve was that 10 years ago, everyone would say, well, shadow economies is massive, everyone's at it. Mm-hmm. Simply providing a figure made a big difference and kind of gave a reference point around which the discussion could take place, rather than this sort of lazy blanket assumption that it's everywhere, 50%, something like that. Started off, I think when you started off, it was down to about a third, and now it's reduced to about a quarter.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we, without being arrogant, I think I can claim that we are playing some role in the shadow economy debate, not just in the overall debate, but also when it comes to, for instance, some industry level issues, such as shadow economy or construction industry in general. The construction industry, they were the first ones from the industries that admitted that they really have big problems, the major problems, and industry association came to us and said that why don't we cooperate? And they were ready to fund the survey and the research, and it has been 5 years when we are working also with them. So that is one of the spillovers of the overall shadow economy.
And was this because I imagine in construction the shadow economy is big, but also must hugely skew the market, maybe to a more extreme level than in other sectors?
Well, in construction industry, shadow economy is higher as compared to other industries.
Because of cash in hand payments and things like that.
Many issues. For instance, because they are not always in one spot, so they come from one place to another, and that means that for the state revenue service or whoever is controlling, it's not that easy to trace them, right? Similarly, like in the internet, like music in the internet is quite often illegal or half legal in all countries. Yeah. Then the construction industry is known for a higher shadow economy in general. But not all countries admit that. Not all countries themselves, those are basically the companies themselves who funded the study, not the policymakers or not any sort of mysterious grants or something. So they came with idea to do this, and I think this is another reason why I like it. It's a lot of interaction with the industry, and it's a lot of interaction with the policymakers, and even though the shadow economy started from the business, when that I was involved in, it was then the Ph.D. studies, which is academic sort of issue. Then we created the shadow economy index, which was sort of applied research. But from the shadow economy index, then we published academic paper about this. Then in one of the conferences, I had a conversation with former Minister of Economics, and he said that, well, we are also interested in the tax morale issue. The tax morale is basically defined whether people would be hiding taxes if they have a chance of doing that. And we also wrote academic paper after this conversation with that former minister. So it's back and forth basically. So I think it adds to the policy debate in one way or another, but it also comes back to the academic world, and we benefit as researchers who work with the data, and then again at some point we return back to this policy making, and it's. These are different worlds. In one you are wearing the suit, in another you are typing at home, right? But it's I would say it's not always easy, but it's lots of fun, definitely.
And you mentioned earlier on that it's really the application of the research which is important, and also which gives you the sense of mastery of it, or that you kind of know the subject. How far can you go in recommending to policymakers, or pointing them in the right direction, what might be the applied solutions that are suggested by the data? And are there any sort of differences between the way that you would approach them and the way maybe you would approach your academic colleagues when you're presenting data, or presenting a logical development of the data?
Of course, it's like day and night. Certainly, I mean, in the academic conference, what are the topics that you are discussing? You are interested in some sort of development of conceptual frameworks or models. And you can talk a lot about what has been written about this, and who said this, and what that perspective think, and what that another perspective think, and criticize each other, and try to kind of improve the model in one way or another. You can talk a lot about methodological choices. You can talk about the data, about how you interpret it, how you all the bits and all the regressions and all the things that are involved. Policymakers do not care about all this, and neither companies care about these things. Policymakers care about what they can do with those, how they can apply those things, and of course the way you present and the way you talk about these issues to the policymakers are very, very, very different. It's always shorter, of course, even though I was also told that initially, it should be on one page. I think if it's worth reading, it could be also on 6 pages. Because sometimes you cannot put everything on one page, but still it's never on the 50 pages, right? And they don't care about regressions, or they don't care about the conceptual frameworks. You can mention that they exist, but they will not read them. They care, of course, on what they can do with this. And for instance, if they say that envelope wages are rising, or if they say that trust towards the government is decreasing, then I think they know what to do about this. In academic world, these trends are not that important. They care more about the clock mechanism instead of what time really the clock shows, and how to sort of improve the clock.
So could you just give an example of how something has emerged in one of your studies, which has then led to either a policy change or a business changing its business model, or something like that? A practical application.
You mean practical application from the Share of Economy Index, or practical?
Well, from any of the reports you've done as well. I mean, there's another influential one is the Foreign Investors Council in Latvia Sentiment Index, which is another one which a lot of people take a great deal of notice of, which interestingly is, I mean, that word sentiment, you always kind of dance around it a little bit, because it might be guided by principles which aren't necessarily, or they may amplify the real picture, they may underplay the real picture. Yeah.
Well, sentiment is of course important for various reasons, but the most important reason is that the sentiment probably influences the behavior on a big extent, and then if the company manager has an attitude towards something, then it's very likely that he or she will act accordingly. In bigger companies might do it maybe on a less extent, because they might have R&D departments, and they might rely more on the data. But the small company managers will basically act drawing on the sentiment they have, and nothing can stop them of doing that. We all know that foreign investors are important for countries, and also Latvia, the country that is developing hopefully towards the right direction, and that's why we also launched this study. And I'm not sure whether we have really influenced the policy agenda with this sentiment index, but we have gathered the information from the foreign investors and we gather it in a form of quotes, basically. So this is what. So we deliver a book basically to the policymakers, showing them word by word what the bigger foreign investors in Latvia are saying. And if they do not care to listen to academics, which they sometimes do not, then they should care about listening to what, I don't know, Microsoft Latvia people say, or Circle K people say, or some other like big investors that employ lots of people. And I think it should have some impact, even though I cannot really mention a good example of kind of what has been really changed or something. But I think it should have an impact also because the foreign investors are talking about the same challenges as Latvia is. Latvian companies, the local companies, are facing, and that is important in order to improve this overall business climate. Maybe this could be a good example. The foreign investors are talking a lot about. They were talking a lot about insolvency, problems with insolvency. I think that changed. And I think the Ficil, the Foreign Investor Council in Latvia, for whom we are doing this sentiment index, did a lot in order to improve. Currently, Ficil is involved a lot in the debate when it comes to quality of education and science, which of course affects the foreign investors companies that are here, but it does affect also all of us that live here. Regardless of the nationality, are we locals or not locals here? So many things like that. Then apart from this study, we just published also with the same co-author Talis Putniņš a paper on in strategic management, where we show that risk taking is the only factor that directly influences the performance of the company. So previously it was emphasized in entrepreneurship research literature that this is innovation that matters most. But what we are showing is that yes, innovation is important, but nothing happens without the ability to take a risk. So constructive risk taking, which means that risk taking that is also associated with innovation, has a big likelihood to foster the performance of the company. Yeah. But only innovation without risk taking will not lead to this type of behavior. And this type of research, which is very academic research, has a number of implications. For instance, if you hire in a top management a person who cannot take risks, could be very smart with the top university degrees, but cannot take risks for any reason, then you did the wrong choice. Basically, this is what our paper suggests, and this is paper that is published in top 3 entrepreneurship research kind of journals in the world, which took us 6 or 7 years to do. Not always easy, and it was quite a painful process in terms of publication. So I could continue with others. Some are more known in the public debate, some are less known. Some will be known, some might not be known.
But I think this is quite a good place to wrap up, and I really like the idea of you at some point in the future having to present to policymakers the idea that actually risk-taking is necessary, and particularly maybe what you've learned in business or what applies to business could apply in the world of politics as well. And it's risk-taking ministers who are the successful ones rather than the ones playing safe, because I think that could present some interesting reactions from them.
Well, to conclude, maybe one of my friends who is working in the public sector once told me that the bureaucracy is a good thing, and I was like, wow, how can it? Because in entrepreneurship we are always talking about that less bureaucracy is good, and then I thought for a moment, and I realized that he's actually right. The risk-taking and fast actions are very good for development, and quite often in a business you cannot really work without that. But if everything changes in the government, like new minister comes, we have a new tax reform. Then new minister comes, we have something else new. So that this bureaucracy and this too much of risk taking actually is helpful, but it's helpful for us not to go too far in one direction or another, especially because policymakers, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, still are making lots of decisions drawing on not on the data but on whatever reasons, and then you can really harm a lot. You can do a lot of harm working like this. So risk taking maybe in a policy, it is important, maybe to the extent, but not to the extent as an entrepreneurship setting.
Well, Professor Arnis Sauka, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSE Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSE Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.